Good evening, everyone. Joseph has given me the signal that it's time to start, and we're going to be doing online streaming tonight. And wow, this looks like our average Wednesday night crowd. So good to see everyone. We have many visitors and anxious to hear Dr. Brown. For many of you that are not here on Wednesday night, we usually just have a short time of prayer and pray, and then we have Bible study tonight. We're going to do the same, and going to have prayer, and Miss Beth is going to introduce our speaker, and then we're going to listen to Dr. Brown. So glad. On our prayer list tonight, we have the Gladys Talley family. She was buried this morning. Continuing to remember Dawn. Talked to her this afternoon, and she is having severe pain behind one of her knees. She says she just basically has to drag herself to walk. Continuing to remember Taylor. She is here tonight from having oral surgery. Continuing to remember Debbie Stegall. And then Rhodey Tabor, the little boy 2 years old that we prayed about a year and a half ago. He was 2 years old. That his heart and most of his heart was engulfed with a tumor down to his kidney. He went back to Charleston today for a scan. He's probably 3.5 years old by now. So his mother was raised next door to us, and so we're waiting on the result of that. But pray for Rhodey. Gerald Owens, he needs iron infusion, but right now their insurance will not cooperate to cover that, and he desperately needs this as he's battling this situation. Pray that the door would be open there. Sam Nego, general surgeon from Bunia, Congo, has Ebola. This is at the request of Dr. Brown. Let's remember him. And we have several shut-ins. Continue to remember the pastor search committee here at Cleveland First. Do you have any requests? Let's pray, and then we'll recognize Miss Beth. Lord, I pray that you'd be in our midst tonight. I pray that you would just be here, Lord, that your spirit would dwell with us. Thank you for this wonderful number of people that have come out, and Lord, I pray that you'd be with Dr. Brown as he stands and gives us this presentation. Thank you for the ministry, his faithfulness over this many, many years, as has been a medical missionary to dark places of the world. I pray for these requests tonight, Lord. I lift them up to you, this family that is bereaved, these ones that had tests. I pray that you would supply the need in Gerald's life, that the insurance would be worked out. I pray for this doctor in the Congo, Lord, and just so many more. Lord, thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you for your goodness, Lord. Thank you for your love. Most of all, thank you for salvation and forgiveness. And we pray and ask this in thy humble and holy name. Amen.
This looks good. I am so excited about everybody coming tonight. I've been looking forward to this. It's going to be good. We're just blessed to have Dr. Jim Brown and Carolyn and missionary friends of his here tonight. And I see another missionary, David Boyd, are back there. Thank you for coming. Most of you, or I say a good many of you, already know who Jim is. Jim and Carolyn, they are the grandparents or the parents of Julie and their children. You see, raise your hand and wave. Grandchildren over here. And they're mine as well. Casey and Julie have blessed us with 8 grandchildren, and I can't get ahead of y'all. How many do you have? 19. I only have 15. And every time she has one, Julie has one, they get it too. So I can't get ahead, but y'all are doing really good. Dr. Brown was in the Navy for 20 years as a general surgeon. He was there till he retired. Now, if I mess up, you correct me, okay? He retired. He and Carolyn went to Cameroon as medical missionaries. They were with the Pan-African Academy of Christian Surgeons, and they served there for 15 years. Carolyn was a nurse who was specializing in wound care, and she also taught wound care there and other places. And then Jim, of course, was a surgeon, but he was also busy teaching. And he was mentioning that the one that we were praying for that has the Ebola was one of your graduates, right? Is that that's what you were saying? So he was teaching, and he now is head of a hospital where he in Bunya, or I believe it is. Okay, so Jim was teaching all these, as he's performing surgery on people that need help, he's also was teaching, which is pretty awesome. And in fact, he was awarded in 2022 with the Academic Global Surgeon Award by the American College of Surgeons, which was quite an honor for helping and teaching these in third, I guess you could say, in third world places. When his time was up in Cameroon, he moved to the States. He settled in Marietta, right here among us, and right across the street, actually, or the road from Casey and Julie. So it's been wonderful having him here. But Jim is not retired because he is busy. He's busy with the International Humanitarian Disaster Area Relief Team, and I'm sure he would, there it is. I had part of it right, and then I had to fix it because I only had the Disaster Area Relief Team. But that is with Samaritan's Purse, and that's what he's going to be sharing with us this evening. So I'm going to say no more, and I'm anxious to hear what he has to say, and let's just welcome him.
Well, thank you, Beth, and thank you for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here. As you heard, Carolyn and I were missionaries in Cameroon for 15 years, and my primary job there was to teach general surgery in a fully accredited residency program, 5-year training program, African physicians becoming surgeons. Carolyn taught wound care. She was instrumental in setting up health wound care clinics and training nurses. And so today there's one in all of the major Baptist hospitals and health centers in Cameroon. But that's not our topic tonight. When we came home in December of 2022, I contacted Samaritan's Purse, and I wanted to be on their disaster assistance response team. I knew about them, and they were willing to send me to some training, and I've been working with them since. Tonight I'm going to take you through some of the places that I've been in the last 3.5 years. And there's no terrible graphic medical pictures up here, but there are some hard stories. But I think the overriding story is the way God works through in places where people have great need. Medical care is a wonderful platform for the gospel. Puts you in front of people you would otherwise never know or work with. But anyway, I'll tell you, take you through some of that. Actually, it says international humanitarian aid. My first deployment with Samaritan's Purse was actually a domestic deployment. In sorry there, Joseph, it didn't go. No, it's on. It worked 3 minutes ago. It's possible that I need another battery. Okay, there you go. All right, no problem. So in 2020, we came home because our granddaughter was going to have heart surgery, and that was done, and she did well, and we had tickets to return to Cameroon on March 19th. Well, 2 days before we were to return, and Cameroon closed its borders, and we couldn't go back. This was because of COVID. And the next week, I got an email just sort of out of the blue from Samaritan's Purse saying they were asking for volunteers to serve in a respiratory care hospital for COVID. I didn't know where it was, and I didn't know whether they needed a surgeon, but I put my name in, and the next day they called and asked me if I could be in New York City the next morning. So we scrambled around that day, and Carolyn took me to the airport, and the next morning I was in New York in Central Park, and I don't think this will work too well. I'm just going to tell you, do you see those little white spots there toward the bottom? This is Central Park. This is looking in Manhattan South. Those are tent hospitals set up right on Fifth Avenue across the street from the main campus for the Mount Sinai Hospital. The morning I got to New York, there were 1,000 people a day dying in New York City from COVID. All the emergency rooms in the city were saturated. People were sometimes waiting 24, 48 hours for admission. New York was shut down. The only vehicles on the road were police cars, ambulances, and hearses. And while we set up our hospital, we could look across the road at the Mount Sinai Hospital loading dock, and there were 4 refrigerator trucks there for the bodies. And fear was everywhere. So I didn't know until I got there what my job would be. I was going to be the doctor in the ICU for 12-hour night shifts, 7 days a week for the next 5 weeks. And we didn't really know what we were dealing with. COVID at that time, if you can remember, was a new thing. We knew that it affected the lungs, that it caused respiratory disease and failure, but it wasn't like normal pneumonia, like bacterial pneumonias that we were used to, or lung trauma, or any of the other pulmonary diseases. And there hadn't been any studies done. Nobody knew what worked. We didn't have any vaccines. We just knew that it was killing a lot of people. So the ICU I worked in had 10 beds. There was also a 12-bed step-down unit. Those were people that didn't need a ventilator, but they needed respiratory assistance. The ICU then, 80% of the patients that we put on ventilators died. We knew it was a lung disease, but what we began to see right away was also attacked the vascular system. So we began seeing heart attacks, strokes, kidney failure, intestinal bleeding, blood clots going to the lungs. And basically our treatment consisted of oxygenation, fluids, and managing all the complications. Most of our patients were indigent patients. Many of them were immigrants. Some were from nursing homes, some were from homeless shelters, some were from prisons. But we took care of them, and it was a very intense time, as you'll remember. As I said, we came home in 2022 at December, and just, again, I notified Samaritan's Purse to ask to be on their roster for disaster relief. And in early February, there were 2 massive earthquakes in southern Turkey and northern Syria that killed 50 to 60,000 people, and there were thousands of people still caught in the rubble. And Turkey asked for aid, and Samaritan's Purse sent their largest field hospital. This was an incredible place. The devastation was just everywhere. Most people were living outside in the cold. It was still winter. Our team flew to a city called Adana, which is in Turkey, about 200 miles from the center of the earthquake damage. And then the next day, the Turkish Air Force flew us by this Chinook helicopter into the disaster zone and dropped us in the hospital parking lot. And you can't see from this picture, but that tall building is a hospital. And if you were standing over in that far corner and looked at that hospital, you could see the sky on the other side because the building was split down the middle. 150 people died in that hospital during the earthquake, and the floors inside just collapsed like a pile of pancakes. Our hospital had 2 operating rooms. We had an ICU. We had a very large emergency room. We had about 60 other beds. We got there and saw the first patient 6 days after the trauma, and they were still finding living people in the rubble. For the first 10 days, 14 days, we did primarily earthquake trauma, people with broken bones and crush injuries and all kinds of wounds. And we saw a lot of burns. People were cooking on open fires outside. There were also fuel leaks, and so burns was a major part of what we were doing. This is a picture inside the operating room. We were doing about 15 to 20 major operations a day and at least that many minor procedures. Our power was from a generator. You can see the electric overhead lights, and there's a cautery machine there. This is a picture of our anesthesia machine, and we were able to do a lot of surgery. And at the time, all the hospitals within a 200-mile region were non-functional. They weren't working. And we couldn't get patients in and out. The roads were down, and transport was very difficult. For days, all we heard were helicopters landing and leaving day and night. And so we were doing a lot of trauma care. But then also what happened, because there were no other functioning hospitals, we began to get all the other surgical emergencies besides trauma. So we were doing appendectomies and gallbladder surgery and ectopic pregnancies and bowel obstructions, whatever they needed, because there was no other place to go. There were other hospital or other non-government organizations that showed up, but none of them came with an operating room. You know, an earthquake is trauma, and trauma is a surgical disease. So the fact that we had the operating rooms made us very important for that period of time. And then a little bit later that year in Liberia, there was a tanker truck that turned over and started spilling gasoline on the road. And a lot of the local people gathered around to try to get gasoline in containers for their vehicles. And somehow there was a spark or a cigarette or something, and that it exploded. 40 people were incinerated right on the spot, and 80 people were severely burned. Well, there are no burn centers in Liberia. Patients were distributed to 4 other hospitals, including this hospital called ELWA. That stands for Eternal Love Winning Africa. It's a Christian mission hospital on the Atlantic Ocean just south of the capital in Monrovia. So we had a team of 5 people, myself and an anesthetist. We had 2 burn nurses and an ICU nurse. And when we got to this hospital, 3 of the surgeons that I knew from training were the surgeons at this hospital. And they were overwhelmed. We told them, you guys just take care of the other stuff and we'll do the burn work. And so for the next 3.5 weeks, we did just burn care. That was daily dressing changes in the operating room with debridements. And a little bit toward the end of the deployment, I started doing skin grafts on the patients that were ready. Most of you know that there's a terrible civil war in Sudan. Sudan is in northeast part of Africa, and you can see it, the red area on the map of Africa. It's just south of Egypt. It borders the Red Sea in a little portion. It's got the Nile River that divides it down the middle. And then in 2011, South Sudan broke off from the upper part of Sudan to form a separate country. I can't show you with my pointer, but our team, first of all, Samaritans first tried to get into Sudan right after the war began, but they couldn't get in. The place we came in was through Port Sudan, which is right on the Red Sea, and then about a 12-hour drive south, we set up in a place called Gaddaref. So a dictator named Omar al-Bashir was the ruler of Sudan for almost 30 years, and then in 2019, the Sudanese army and another paramilitary force called the Rapid Support Forces overthrew Bashir, and they decided to co-rule Sudan until democratic elections could be held. Well, that never happened, and in April of 2023, the two military forces began fighting each other, and then a horrific civil war broke out, which is still raging. And like most wars, it's the civilians that bear the brunt of it. Most of them were, it's the women and the children that I think suffer the most. But in Sudan today, as we sit in this room tonight, there are 14 million displaced people, internally displaced people in Sudan because of the war, and there are another 3 million across the border in Chad and in Egypt. We differentiate people that are displaced from their homes. If they're still in their country, we just call them IDPs, or internally displaced people. If they cross the border, they're a refugee, and that's kind of a funny distinction, but the terms are kind of interchangeable for what the conditions that people are facing. More than half of the population is facing humanitarian need, primarily hunger. 70 to 90% of IDPs are women and children, and you say, well, where are the men? Well, the men are either fighting, hiding, or they're dead. But many of these women and children are on their own without the men. It's been estimated that there have been 600,000 deaths. That's probably way underestimated with the severity of this war. The war has been characterized by exceptionally severe brutality. Many people have been killed. There's sexual violence has been part of just to intimidate the population, massive hunger. There's been chemical weapons used. Drone warfare has made its way there now. And there has been genocide, especially in the western part of the country. The World Health Organization has designated Sudan as the world's most severe humanitarian crisis, and that's been true for several years. It doesn't get the same press that Gaza or Ukraine or some of the other wars get, but it is a really, truly awful war. On December 7th, 2024, I was part of an advance team that flew to Port Sudan, and then we went south to Gaddarf to try to pick a site to set up an emergency field hospital. Gaddarf is a city of about 125,000 people normally, but at the time we were there were an additional 500,000 internally displaced people in camps. We looked at several hospitals. We met with the Ministry of Health. They wanted us to set up in a big field adjacent to a women's hospital. And so we did that. It took another week to get the emergency field hospital into the country through customs and by trucks up down to Gaddarf. During that time, while I was in Gaddarf, before the field hospital came, I went to the women's hospital and I worked there for 4 days. And it's just a scene I can hardly describe. I went to the labor deck, and there were, all the beds had at least 2 women in them, maybe 3, in the same bed in labor, if you can imagine. They had 3 delivery tables. There were midwives delivering the babies, and it was like an assembly line. One woman would deliver, she'd get off the table, another woman would get on the table, and this was 24 hours a day. They had 2 operating rooms right by labor and delivery for emergencies. Emergency C-sections primarily, but other gynecologic emergencies. And then upstairs they had 5 operating rooms where they did 25 to 35 elective surgeries a day. And I worked up there, and it was incredibly chaotic, very dehumanizing experience, almost no sense of sterile technique. What they needed wasn't more people. They had people. What they needed was capacity, and we could provide that because when our field hospital got there, we had an operating room. You know, Samaritan's Purse has different kinds of hospitals for different kind of responses. For example, the hospital you need for an earthquake is different than you need for a refugee camp, or different than you need for a pandemic or an epidemic. But we had what's called a Tier 1 hospital. It's 1 operating room. We had 36 beds, 12 were designated for labor and delivery, 12 were for pediatrics, and then 12 were pre- and post-operative surgical patients. And so our primary job, we chose to treat only women and children from the IDP camps who had no money, and there were thousands of them. And so that was our mandate, was to do that. we had a basic pharmacy and a lab. We had a build team. The WASH team, that stands for Water and Sanitation and Hygiene, and they were the people that were in the desert, and so water was a big entity and problem. We were able to get that through their work. And then security. We're in a country at war, and the war was just, half a day's drive away. We weren't treating war injuries this time. We were treating women and children from the camps. So we didn't see war injuries, but we saw a lot of very traumatized people. Many of these women had seen their family members murdered. Many of them had been sexually assaulted while fleeing. It was hard. And so we also needed crowd control. We had a little fence around the perimeter for the compound we were working on, and there was huge crowds out in the street trying to get in, and it was so painful. You knew these people were desperate, but you took police and military people just to provide the security for us to be able to work. This is a picture of the operating room, and you can see the mosque in the background. Sudan is about 99% Muslim, and it's a very strict form of Islam. Samaritans Purse always tries to work through the local church. Well, we didn't know if we were going to find any Christians in Gadar, but the day or two after we got there, a man came up and said he was a leader in a local Christian church. And Samaritans Purse hired him. They hired him as a security person, but basically what he became was a translator, and he helped us interact with the community, which is really important. He understood the culture. He knew how to get things done. And that's one of the marvelous things that Samaritans Purse does. Everywhere we go, they integrate nationals into our staff. And we need them. We need them for a lot of reasons, and a lot of wonderful stories come out of working with them in the hospital. This is inside the operating room. My main operation was C-section, and I did as many pediatric cases as I could get into a day. We were covering not only doing elective repeat C-sections and other gynecologic procedures, but we were covering the call for our own labor and delivery at night. So about every other night we'd get called in at night, but there were long days. The Sudanese government sent some of their OBGYN residents to work with us. So I'm operating with a Sudanese resident in OBGYN, and that was really great. You develop rapport, you develop a relationship, you have conversations, and we needed them. We were a small team. We only had 27 people. Well, a Tier 1 hospital requires about 60 people to run. So, as I said, these camps had doctors, nurses, and other people that we could hire, and so we supplemented our staff with them. What we're actually doing is praying before we did a operation, and which we do before every operation. And again, even though we were in an Islamic country, there was respect for each other, and we were able to, they knew we were Christians, and they saw a side to us that I think many of them had never seen before. The pediatricians were extremely busy. The main diagnoses were malnutrition, malaria, anemia, respiratory diseases, intestinal worms and infections. These are twins, but actually they were triplets. One of them died. And, we're in the desert. Well, the desert gets real cold at night, and these are little premature babies, and we didn't have an incubator, so our build team made one out of some scrap lumber, and we used a nurse's hairdryer as the heat source for our incubator. But that's what we used for the babies that needed that. And then the other thing that happened, during the day, the desert gets hot, especially if you're in a tent. And so the nurses came and said, all of our babies have a fever in the day. And we said, We moved them all to the pharmacy, which was one of two air-conditioned tents. The pharmacy and the OR were the only two places there was air conditioning. And you had to have air conditioning in the OR because you couldn't be in those gowns, all day and be able to survive. And so we moved all the babies during the day into the pharmacy, and all their fevers went away. So you take a bunch of children, you put them in a room, and you give them crayons and some paper and some simple toys, and they form their own community. And it was really fun to watch that. The little girl in the middle with the dressings, her name is Menorah. She came to us. She'd been burned about a month before. And we took care of her burns, got them ready. And when I was there, I did a skin graft for her chest and her upper arm. I also operated on her little brother. He had a hernia. Emergency field hospital at Sunset, with some beautiful sunset in the desert. We were there. I was there for 7 weeks. The hospital was there about 3 months. We did 562 deliveries, 194 C-sections, and it's almost or over 9,000 outpatients, and admitted over 1,400 patients to the hospital while we were there. I came home from Sudan the first time on January 18th, 2025. 2 days later, President Trump was inaugurated. And one of the first things he did on the day of his inauguration was to write an executive order that disbanded USAID. That's the United States Agency for International Development. And while I was in Port Sudan waiting for travel documents, I went on a food distribution project. I went with Samaritan's Purse, but when we were going to our project, we stopped in another camp, and I saw the USAID operation. And if you notice on those bags of food there, it says, "From the American people," and I was so proud to be an American. But on that day of January 20th, USAID worldwide was shut down. And I'm not here to make a political statement, but I am here as an eyewitness to the impact that had on millions of people, many of which have died. There were people that couldn't live another day without that food distribution. And USAID had 10,000 national employees scattered around the world doing all kinds of different programs, but food aid was the biggest one, and the U.S. was the biggest part of that program. These are people who had no options and were starving. Tons of food was rotted, never distributed. Drugs expired. Even though they'd been paid for and shipped, there was nobody to distribute them when all those people that were working were fired. And I just have to tell you, I have a real problem with that. The good that we did around this world in places like Sudan, places like Ethiopia, places that, there are many places, gave us a standing in the world that we've lost. And it hurts. It hurts a lot. I won't go say more. 10 months later, I went back to Sudan. This time I went alone. I didn't go through Port Sudan. I came through South Sudan, across the border without a visa, to go to a hospital that was in the Nuba Mountains in Sudan. And that airplane you see up there is a DC-3. It was built in 1946, 80 years ago. It's been refurbished, but Samaritan's Purse uses it to fly cargo and passengers around East Africa. So when I flew into Juba in South Sudan, that's the capital, and I spent a couple of days there. I had to get my visa extended and some travel documents, and then they flew me in that plane up to Yida, which is a refugee camp right on the border with Sudan. And you can see the camp outside the window, and if you look at that picture from the cockpit, there's a little tiny orange spot out in the window. That's the airstrip we're getting ready to land on. And then there we were at the airport lounge in Yida. Welcome to Yida. So you had to have been there to get it. Anyway, the next day, I spent the day the night in Yida, and then I spent 10 hours on this four-wheeler, they call it a quad bike, to get to this other hospital. In fact, we didn't even get there that day. But after 10 hours through off-road trails, and it had just been the end of the rainy season, and a lot of the roads were, if you can call them roads, were washed out. And there was one point where we got too close to the edge, and it flipped over, threw me into the water, completely submerged. My phone, fortunately, was in a Ziploc bag. But, I was orange from tip to toe, headed to the toes, and it was just another day in Sudan, I guess. But I got to the hospital the next day. The hospital sent a Land Rover to get me from the place we were camping that night. So I got there, and Mother of Mercy Hospital is a 480-bed hospital in the Nuba Mountains. The Nuba Mountains have about 1 million people normally. They had 700,000 additional internally displaced people. And there was a war just to the north of us in Darfur. Can't show you with the pointer, but we were just south of the western part of Sudan called Darfur. While I was there, the last holdout of the Sudanese army was overrun by the Rapid Support Forces. They summarily executed thousands of people, including 450 patients and their families in the biggest hospital in Al-Fashir. And over the next few weeks, we got hundreds of people, many, many gunshot wounds, people from war with war injuries, in addition to all the people in the camps, which already had many, many neglected surgical conditions. And it's the hardest deployment I've ever had, completely overwhelmed. And I come in the morning and there'd been 10 more admissions that night. And then I already had an OR schedule that was full. And what do you do with these 10? Well, you see who needs it the most and you do the ones you can. But the whole time, there's all these people that you can't get to. Some of them are dying and some of them are giving up and going back into the bush. And so we just operated. And it's the worst injuries I've never seen anything like it. We had a good facility, but everything was chaotic. I would be operating, and they'd come in and say, "You need to see this person." A few hours later, I'd go to find that person, couldn't find them. Nurses didn't know where they were. There was no very porous doors. People would come and go, and it was just chaos. But we were very, very busy. The hospital had 2 large adult wards, a male and a female ward. They had 90-bed pediatrics ward. They also had a ward for TB, a ward for HIV. They had a ward for leprosy. And just as I got there, they had just been through a cholera epidemic that killed 3,000 people, and they said that was just the people they saw, and they suspected it was twice that many. Again, you can't get your mind around the numbers or the degree of suffering, and in addition to the malnutrition and the starving. I came home from that, and then also last year in March, you may remember there was another massive earthquake in Myanmar. Myanmar's a country in South Central Asia, used to be called Burma. It's ruled by a military junta that overthrew a democratically elected government in 2020. So the country is another country at war. The government many of the tribal people especially are in constant fighting. It's a closed country. You can almost not get there. When they had this earthquake, it was almost in the capital of the country, and it was a devastating earthquake, like they all are. So the country asked for international aid. So Samaritans Purse had sent first a mobile surgical team, and then 2 days later the emergency field hospital arrived. We set up our hospital in a soccer stadium, and there was a big gymnasium on that same sports compound, and the government had put about 100 patients there waiting for us when we got there, most of them with fractures. Just like in Turkey, the first 10 days, 2 weeks, we just did earthquake trauma, fractures and wounds, and lots of trauma. But we began to realize this was another country where there was a chronically neglected, medically needy population, and many of them had been subject to war. So we saw 350 outpatients a day. We had a big emergency room there. Again, that was not getting all the patients that were there, but the ones that we could. We had an ICU. We had, this time we had 2 orthopedic surgeons and 2 general surgeons. So we were able to do 15 to 20 major operations a day, as well as a lot of other minor surgery. There was, again, talk about traumatized population. We're talking about people who live in constant fear. And I remember one morning on rounds in Myanmar, there was a lady there who had a big wound on her arm. We were doing dressing changes every day till her wound was ready for a skin graft. And one day I told her through an interpreter that, she could really go home, or we could do her dressing changes as an outpatient till she was ready for surgery. And she said something. I had never heard the lady speak, but I could tell every day she was really emotionally traumatized. And she said something to the interpreter, and the interpreter turned to me and she said, she doesn't want to go. She said, this is the only place she feels safe. Just think about that, Safety, we take it for granted. We take our next meal for granted. Freedom, security, those are wonderful, wonderful gifts for which we're not to feel guilty, we're to feel grateful. But we need to be aware that billions of people in this world do not have those things. One last story. 2 years ago this month, I went with a small team from Samaritan's Purse to a hospital called The Teen. It's in Western Kenya. And this team was there to take care of women who suffered obstetric trauma. And by that I mean most women in Africa, especially in rural Africa, deliver in the village, sometimes with a midwife. But sometimes things don't go well, and if the baby gets stuck and the lady needs a C-section, many of them can't get a C-section. If the mother survives and delivers the baby's usually dead, but the women are often left with these terrible injuries to their bladder or to their rectum and their anus, so that they become incontinent of urine and incontinent of stool. And they become social outcasts. They don't have problems with hygiene. They smell bad. Often they're abandoned by their husbands or their families. It's hard to go to the market, to be out in public, and they live with that. But those are correctable problems most of the time. Sometimes it's complicated surgery, but they can be fixed. So our team went to do that. We had a surgeon that did the urinary fistulas, which I don't have that much expertise with, but she could do that. We didn't see many urinary fistulas, but we found 20 women that had fecal incontinence because of birth injuries and trauma to their anus and their sphincter. So most of those women were fairly young, in their 20s or 30s, a few in the 40s. But this lady is Anna. She's 69 years old. She had her birth injury when she was 19 years old. For 50 years, she was incontinent of stool. I was able to fix her sphincter. It was not that complicated, and repair the septum between the rectum and the vagina. And this picture was taken the third postoperative day, and that morning she had her first bowel movement with control through her rectum instead of her vagina in 50 years, and she wept. So did I. I mean, the suffering is just beyond my ability to tell you. And so there's so many opportunities to go to these places and make huge difference in people's lives. And the other thing that we can do is do it in Jesus' name. Do it coupled with the gospel. It is a powerful way to reach people who would never otherwise be reached. And I've been able to see that. I want to take the last few minutes to just talk about a few principles. In a disaster, time is of essence. And so Samaritan's Purse has developed these mobile surgical teams. It's 5 people. It's a surgeon, an anesthetist, emergency room doc, an OR nurse, and an ER nurse. And we can take everything on a commercial airline and we call it going far fast, because if you can get there in that golden hour when people are trapped in the rubble and just been injured, you can save a lot of lives, and every hour matters. It took us 6 days to get to the field hospital up in Turkey. By then, many, many people died that wouldn't have died if we'd been able to get there quicker. The other thing is show up ready to work. Bring what you need. As I mentioned, in Turkey, there were at least 10, maybe 20 other organizations there. Nobody had an operating room. They go to a disaster and there's nobody, the main thing you're seeing is trauma. And so showing up with what you need and being ready to work is really important. Samaritan's Person doesn't go anywhere without an invitation by the Ministry of Health, and that takes an organization that has international connections to do that, and they do. They have a hotline to the State Department. They can get us in these places, and they can do the paperwork behind the scenes. And then I mentioned that you have to just set your mandate. In earthquakes, it's trauma. In Gedaref, it was women and children from the IDP camps. You can't take care of everybody, and you have to focus on who you can do the most for and with what you have. It's also important to work collaboratively with other NGOs. So with the World Health Organization, the International Committee for the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, often we're working in the same region. And to be working collaboratively, some of those organizations have things we don't, some we have things that they don't. If we know that and we can direct patients, we can do a much better job. And then I've already mentioned the importance of incorporating the nationals into the staff. What's so amazing is the relationships you form. And most of these people, they want to do something for their country. They're the victims of this devastation, and to give them a job and something to do, it just changes them. And then it's amazing. You take people from any culture, language, or religion, you put them in a place where they are working together focused on a mission, and all kinds of barriers go down. All kinds of ministry happens. It just does. It's one of those things that if you have a mindset to see it and build on it, you can have such an impact on so many lives. I could tell you stories till tomorrow of just the nationals that we've worked with. You have to stay focused on humanitarian aid and don't get into the politics. This was a big problem for us in Cameroon. I didn't talk about Cameroon, but the last 5 years we were in Cameroon, we were in a very violent civil war. It was a lot heavy at the beginning. It eased off some toward the end, but we were always being threatened by both sides. We were taking care of military soldiers, and we were taking care of the insurgents, the ambas as they call themselves. And both sides threatened us and said, you can't take care of our enemies. And our statement was, we take care of anybody, no matter who they are, who they're affiliated with, how they got hurt. We don't even ask those questions. We take care of them. And you know that. We'll take care of you tonight if you get shot. And they knew it, and so they threatened us, but we were able to survive. But if the moment we would have said, no, we're aligned with one side, we would become the enemy of the others, and we would have never been able to work there. But that's a very touchy dance, and you never know how that's going to play out. It was difficult. And then, of course, respect the customs, the religion, and the history of the people. And it's important to inform yourself as much as you can about these places before you go. This is next to the last slide. Security is really important. And, Samaritan's Purse, we are we have to have a security course before we can do these deployments. And they're good. They teach you how to not be a target, to understand how to behave at a checkpoint, or to tell a checkpoint from a roadblock or an ambush, or what if you're kidnapped or you're being held hostage. They take you through those scenarios. It's very realistic, and it's important to have that training. And then crowd control. I mentioned Sudan, but actually everywhere we've been, that has been a big issue. And you have to have somebody else doing that, because you have to focus on the health care, but you can't focus on the health care if you don't have security. You can't have people just coming into the perimeter, or people being targeted. Patients have to be able to get to. The roads have to be open. Sometimes they're not open because of an earthquake, or sometimes they're not open because they're not secure. And then always have an evacuation plan. Have a rendezvous point if you have to leave. And everybody's required to have a go bag. And that means if they say you have to leave right now, you have to be able to pick up your go bag and get in a car or a helicopter. Actually, Carol and I are going back to Cameroon for 2 weeks in August. if I can get in Sudan, I want to go back to Sudan in November. It's the place where I feel the most impelled to go with the need. I don't know if I can get in, especially with Ebola in East Africa now. It may not be accessible, but we'll see. And I don't know how long I can do this. I'm getting old, and I get tired easier and all that kind of thing. But as long as God gives health and strength and means, I want to keep doing this. But I want to be careful, and I don't want to be foolish. And there was a time when physically and mentally, you can't do it, and I don't want to miss the time. Some people have already told me I'm getting close. So, anyway, any other questions? Yes. Some places they speak English, but often we have a translator, and that's what they always do. They'll hire translators, and in this operating room in Turkey, we had a translator for each operating room, and you couldn't function without that. And the same in Gedaref, we had translators that helped us. A few places people speak English. A number of people actually speak English in Sudan. But that's a big, important issue, is communicating, and there's a lot of, they have to pay a lot of attention to that. Otherwise, it's easy to make really bad cultural mistakes or miss the point and not know what the patient's trying to communicate. Anybody else? Yeah. Oh, yeah. When we went to Turkey, the Turkish government said, yeah, we want you to come, but no talking about Christianity, no public worship, no singing, no Bibles, no distribution of materials, period. And so we tried to abide by that. But every morning we would meet about 6:30 to just pray. We didn't sing because it could be heard. And what we found was that our translators were sneaking under the tent to find out, what are these guys doing? And there was no way to avoid they were interested. And one night I was in the tent, and I went back to, it was late, and I went to get something. It wasn't late, it was about 8 o'clock in the afternoon, and some of the Turkish staff were in the same tent, and one of the young guys who was hired for security came up to me and he said, in English, he said, listen, we know you guys are here because of the earthquake and to provide health care, but he says, you're here for something else. What is it? And I said, well, you asked. But it was a great opportunity. We spent 20 minutes just talking about the gospel. Why are we there? Because we love Jesus. We know that he loves you. And the context to do that is so powerful because they were watching us. Are these guys for real or not? Do they really care this much? And then both of the translators that we had in the operating room, 2 young college students, Saleh and Sinem, both of them later became believers and today they are growing. They're in local churches in their communities. And when we went back to Turkey on a tour of some of the 7 churches that were in the Revelation that are mentioned, and when we went to Istanbul and to Izmir, one of them was in Istanbul, one was in Izmir. I contacted them. They met us for dinner, and we had the most incredible time. They're just hungry, growing young believers, and both of them in good churches, and it's just so gratifying. We won't know till heaven the impact of this. You can't measure this thing. It's too big. And some of the patients, I remember so well this lady, she'd been caught in the rubble. She had a terrible crush injury. She ended up in renal failure. We ended up doing peritoneal dialysis. She had been sent home from 2 other places to die. And when she went home that morning, everybody gathered around her just to say goodbye and sort of a little celebration. And her son started talking about the fact that we were Christians and that what that meant. And so we don't know how God will use all that. It's up to him. But to have those interactions, you can't suppress the gospel. It's going to get out. And that's what I mean. We obeyed the law in Turkey, but a lot of people became Christians. And it was not because we were handing out tracts and having services. I've seen that in many places. Anything else? Any other questions? And
When you go, when you're leaving, do they tell you how long you're going to be there? Or how do you know when you're going to leave?
Most of the places we go urgently. You get a phone call, and it can be very disruptive to your life. But they want you to go for a minimum of 3 weeks, but usually it ends up being 4 or 5, and sometimes it's been 7, depending on their need. And then they have a first wave, and then they have a second wave that relieves you. And usually they're not there more than 2 or 3 months. In Myanmar, we'd been there for 4 weeks, busy, and then one day the government said, you have to leave. We don't know why. I think they realized the earthquake trauma was over and something spooked them. I don't know what. But Miss Mariners Purse is great about getting you there, and they take good care of us. They have great security. You're sleeping sometimes in a tent, and sometimes it's a bit austere, but it's still the best that they take really good care of us. Any other questions? Well, thank you. I appreciate the time that you've given me, and it's been fun.